6:47 in the morning. A gas station 2 blocks from a building that had been on fire 4 hours earlier. A tired man in a soot street uniform reaching for a coffee cup, and a police officer who decided, in the space of a single glance, that the uniform he was looking at had to be a lie. Neither of them knew yet that 4 firefighters were less than 90 seconds away, engine idling toward the same parking lot, about to turn what should have been a quiet, forgettable morning into a story that would end with 2 department chiefs standing side by side in front of television cameras, apologizing for something neither of them had done. Darnell Wilkerson didn't think of himself as a hero, and he genuinely disliked it when people used the word around him. 19 years into the job, the last 6 as captain of Engine 14, he'd come to believe that the difference between a good firefighter and a great one rarely came down to a single dramatic rescue. It came down to 1,000 ordinary mornings of showing up exhausted and doing the work anyway, long after the adrenaline of any individual call had worn off, and all that was left was the simple, repeated discipline of putting on the gear one more time. The Medal of Valor, sitting in a modest frame in his office, earned 3 years earlier for a rescue the local news had covered for nearly a week, embarrassed him slightly every time a visitor noticed it. He kept it there because his crew had insisted on it, not because he believed it captured anything essential about who he actually was. His father had spent 28 years with the same department before retiring as one of the city's first Black Battalion chiefs, and Darnell had grown up understanding the job not as glamour but as obligation, the quiet, unglamorous kind that didn't care whether your knees ached or whether you'd already spent your courage twice that week already. His father used to say that the uniform didn't make a person brave. It just made the choice to keep showing up a little harder to walk away from once you'd put it on. That sense of obligation was exactly what had kept Darnell inside a burning 3rd-floor apartment, well past the point his lieutenant had radioed for him to fall back, finishing a desperate search for a second child after the first had already been handed off to a waiting paramedic on the sidewalk below. He'd joined the department at 24, the same age his father had, and had spent the years since mentoring younger recruits with a patience that several of them later described as the single most steadying influence of their early careers, the kind of captain who corrected mistakes quietly and praised effort loudly, who never once in 19 years raised his voice at a probationary firefighter in front of the rest of the crew. The fire had started just after midnight, an electrical fault in a neighboring unit that spread through shared wall insulation faster than the initial dispatch call had suggested it would. By the time Engine 14 arrived, flames had already reached the 3rd floor of the apartment building. Smoke pouring from 2 windows, and a panicked mother on the sidewalk below was screaming, in a voice that cut through every other sound on the block, that her children were still inside. Darnell went in twice. The first trip he carried out a 9-year-old girl, coughing, terrified but conscious, handing her directly to a waiting paramedic without pausing to catch his breath before turning straight back toward the building. The second trip nearly cost him everything. A section of ceiling came down 12 feet behind him as he finally found the 6-year-old boy curled against the back wall of a closet. Too frightened to call out, and Darnell would later admit, only to his wife, in the quiet of their kitchen 2 days afterward, that for roughly 4 seconds in that smoke-choked room, he had genuinely believed neither of them was walking out of that apartment. They did walk out. Both children were treated for smoke inhalation and released from the hospital within the day, a fact Darnell confirmed personally before he allowed himself to leave the scene. He stayed nearly 2 hours past the official end of his shift finishing incident reports, checking in with the mother, and making sure the displaced family had somewhere warm to go before he finally climbed into his truck, still fully in uniform, soot ground deep into the creases of his knuckles, his eyes raw and burning from smoke that no amount of blinking seemed capable of clearing. The gas station sat directly on his usual route home, the same one he stopped at most mornings for fuel, and what he privately considered the worst coffee in the entire city, which he drank anyway, purely out of stubborn habit. Officer Reginald Foss had been parked there since 5:30 that morning, 3 cups of his own coffee deep, nursing a private frustration that had nothing whatsoever to do with Darnell, a missed promotion the week before, attributed by his supervisor to a thin, unimpressive arrest record, and a quiet, simmering need to prove something concrete before his upcoming performance review. He watched Darnell move slowly across the lot, heavy steps, unfocused eyes, a dark, disheveled uniform that to a man actively looking for an excuse to feel useful that morning read less like 19 hours of exhaustion and more like opportunity walking directly toward him. Foss had stopped 3 different people that month on suspicion of early morning impairment. None of them had resulted in an arrest. He badly wanted one that would. "Sir, hold up a second." Foss approached at a deliberate angle, positioning himself to cut off the direct path to Darnell's truck, his tone already carrying the practiced edge of a man building methodically towards something. "Morning, officer." Darnell's voice was flat with fatigue rather than hostility, the simple, automatic politeness of a man too tired to register any threat in the approach. "Just finishing up here, heading home. You doing all right? You're moving pretty slow for this early." Foss's eyes tracked the dark smudges across Darnell's forearms, the slight dragging stagger in his gait that 19 sleepless hours could explain completely, and that a suspicious imagination could just as easily explain very differently. Long shift. Structure fire overnight and running on fumes. Darnell gestured vaguely toward the patch on his shoulder, too exhausted to elaborate any further, assuming, as most reasonable people would, that the uniform itself answered any remaining question. It didn't answer anything for Foss. That a real department, or one of those costume shops downtown selling Halloween gear? Darnell blinked, the comment taking a long beat to fully register through the thick haze of his exhaustion. "Excuse me. I asked if that uniform's real. You smell like a campfire, your eyes are barely open, and you're stumbling around a gas pump at 6:45 in the morning. I need you to walk a straight line for me right now." "I am not impaired, officer. I'm a fire captain. I was inside a burning building 4 hours ago, pulling 2 children out of it." Darnell's voice sharpened, less from genuine anger than sheer disbelief at needing to explain something that to him was as plainly obvious as the soot still packed beneath his fingernails. Foss didn't move an inch. "Walk the line. Heel to toe right now. This is unnecessary, and I'd like you to stop." Darnell set the coffee cup down with deliberate care, his patience visibly thinning under the accumulated weight of 19 straight hours of strain. "My ID is in my back pocket. My badge number is printed right there on my shirt. Call it in if you genuinely don't believe me, but I am not performing a sobriety test for a condition I do not have. You refusing a lawful instruction. I am telling you clearly that I am not intoxicated, and that you are choosing not to listen to a single word I am saying." Darnell's tone had hardened considerably now, weariness curdling into something closer to controlled, exhausted frustration. A small crowd had begun gathering near the adjacent pumps, 2 commuters slowing their own fueling entirely to watch the exchange unfold. Foss reached for the cuffs clipped to his belt. "Hands on the truck. Now." Darnell complied, placing his blackened palms flat against the hood of his own truck, while Foss patted him down with a theatrical thoroughness that seemed designed less for safety and more for the small audience now watching, narrating the search loudly in a tone that aimed for authority and landed somewhere closer to performance. "This is exactly what we deal with out here. Somebody throws on a uniform shirt from a costume rack and figures it buys them a free pass." "This is not a costume," Darnell said, his jaw tight now, each word arriving slower and more deliberate, costing him visible effort to keep level under the circumstances. "I have proof. I have a badge number printed directly on this shirt. I am asking you one more time to verify before you go any further with this." Foss ignored him entirely, continuing the search well past anything reasonable procedure would have required, the small crowd's quiet discomfort thickening steadily into something closer to open unease. A woman near the second pump had her phone raised now, recording almost without consciously deciding to. It was at that exact moment, with Darnell's hands still pressed flat against cooling metal and Foss's grip tightening visibly around the cuffs, that the unmistakable blast of an air horn cut through the gas station. 2 short, deliberate bursts that anyone who had lived in the city longer than a year would have immediately recognized. Engine 14 rolled into the gas station to refuel before heading back to quarters. The same crew Darnell had spent the entire previous night working beside through smoke, and collapsing ceilings. Lieutenant Maria Suarez was already out of the cab before the truck had fully stopped moving. Her own bone-deep exhaustion from the same overnight shift entirely forgotten the moment she registered her captain pinned against his own truck, with a police officer's hand pressing down on his shoulder. "Captain, what is going on here?" 3 more firefighters followed her out, still wearing their own soot-darkened turnout gear from the same fire, the same unmistakable smoke clinging to all of them, in a way that made Foss's mistake suddenly, almost painfully obvious to absolutely everyone present except Foss himself. I was conducting a routine field sobriety check," Foss started, his earlier certainty visibly fracturing under the sudden weight of 4 uniformed witnesses who clearly recognized exactly who Darnell was. "That is my captain," Suarez said, stepping directly and deliberately between Foss and Darnell without the slightest hesitation. "We just spent 6 straight hours pulling 2 children out of a burning building together. That smell you've apparently mistaken for alcohol as smoke from the same fire half this entire city watched on the morning news. Step back, immediately." Foss stepped back, the cuffs lowering slowly, his earlier confidence draining visibly as the firefighters formed a loose but entirely unmistakable wall around their captain. Darnell straightened up, rubbing absently at his wrist where the rough pat-down had left a faint red mark, his exhaustion now mixing with something quieter and considerably heavier than simple anger, a kind of tired, weary recognition that he was about to have a very different morning than the one he had carefully planned on the drive over. "I want your badge number," he said, voice steady now despite everything. "And I want this incident documented exactly as it happened, not however it might later be convenient to summarize." Suarez already had her own phone out recording the exchange directly and clearly. By the time Darnell's battalion chief arrived at the station house an hour later, the firefighters' union representative had already filed a formal complaint, and a bystander's video, capturing Foss's costume shop remark in full, unedited clarity, had begun circulating through local community groups well before lunchtime that same day. By evening, the footage had reached local television news. By the following morning, the firefighters' union had issued a formal public statement. Several city council members had publicly echoed its concerns, and the police department found itself fielding a wave of pointed questions it had no satisfying answers prepared for. Yet, internal affairs moved with unusual speed, driven heavily by both the sheer volume of public attention and a fire department entirely unwilling to let the incident quietly disappear into a routine complaint log somewhere. Investigators pulled Foss's body camera footage, which confirmed clearly that Darnell had identified himself within the first 30 seconds of the encounter, his speech fully coherent and his explanations specific. A structure fire, 2 children rescued, a badge number offered freely and repeatedly. A subsequent records check produced an uncomfortable detail that significantly complicated Foss's defense. He had completed a joint police fire uniform recognition training session 18 months earlier, a program designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of confusion between the 2 services. In his formal interview, Foss maintained that Darnell's overall appearance had created independent, reasonable suspicion regardless of anything he'd actually said. The investigator, a 12-year department veteran known for direct, unsparing questioning, wasn't moved by the argument in the slightest. "You had 18 months of training specifically telling you what a fire department uniform looks like. You had a man calmly explaining exactly where he had just been and offering identification to prove every word of it. At what precise point did basic verification stop being something you were willing to do?" "I thought he was trying to talk his way out of something," Foss said quietly. "He wasn't talking his way out of anything," the investigator replied without hesitation. "He was telling you the plain truth, and you decided getting a laugh from a crowd of strangers mattered more than simply checking it." Foss was suspended 60 days without pay following the investigation's conclusion, the disciplinary report explicitly citing public mockery of a verifiable public safety professional and a clear failure to verify before escalating to physical detention, with his prior completed training cited specifically as an aggravating factor in determining the suspension's length. A subsequent state licensing review added mandatory retraining as a condition of his eventual return to active duty. The police chief and fire chief held an unusual joint press conference at Darnell's own station house. A public alignment, several reporters noted, wouldn't likely have happened without the sheer volume of pressure the story had generated across multiple news cycles. The fire chief, standing beside his counterpart, told the assembled cameras simply that Darnell represented exactly the kind of public servant this city ought to be lifting up, not mocking at a gas pump hours after he'd pulled 2 children out of a burning building. Darnell didn't pursue a lawsuit. He asked instead for something the city's own attorneys found unusual in its modesty: a joint training session between the 2 departments, built directly around what had happened to him, designed not to further humiliate Foss, but to ensure the next exhausted firefighter standing at a gas pump at 6 in the morning wasn't treated as a suspect simply for the crime of looking tired. He helped design the program personally, alongside Suarez and 2 officers from the police academy who had reached out entirely on their own initiative, uncomfortable with what their colleagues' conduct had revealed about a genuine gap in their own training pipeline. He was back at Engine 14 within the week, uniform freshly laundered, the soot from that overnight fire long since washed away, though the particular memory of standing humiliated at a gas pump after the hardest night of his year took considerably longer to fade entirely. His crew never discussed it directly amongst themselves, but they began quietly finding reasons to swing by that exact same station with him, after especially rough overnight calls, engine idling nearby. An unspoken kind of company that needed no explanation whatsoever among people who had run into the same burning buildings together more times than any of them could easily count anymore. This is a story about how quickly 19 years of earned trust can be erased by a stranger who decides, before checking anything at all, that they already know exactly what they're looking at, and about how much harder it always proves to undo that assumption than it ever was to make it in the first place. If this one got to you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more stories of justice finally catching up.